In the winter of 1901, the most powerful woman in the world died in a bedroom on a small island in the English Channel. Queen Victoria ruled a quarter of the planet, and she had chosen this island as her private home, buying it with her own money for £28,000. For more than 50 years, the Isle of Wight was the most fashionable address in Britain, because the Queen was here and the world followed her across the water. But the crossing that carried them here is now the reason the island is emptying out. Cross to the island today, and there is no ruin waiting at the ferry ramp. Close to 2 million people still visit every year, and around 140,000 still live there. What has gone is the reason it was ever grand. Nobody sails across now for the royal court, or for the cure that once made London doctors send the dying here, or for the festival that briefly turned a chalk hillside into one of the largest crowds the country had ever held. The house where Victoria died still stands above the sea. Her private rooms were sealed on her son's orders the day she died, and were never lived in again. The island sits just off the south coast of England, a diamond of chalk and green farmland cut off from the mainland by a narrow arm of sea called the Solent, only a few miles wide at its broadest. For most of its history, that channel made the place feel apart, slower and quieter than the country it belonged to, close enough to reach in under an hour and far enough to feel like somewhere else entirely. None of the decline to come was written into it at the start. For most of a century, the island was the opposite of forgotten, and it owed almost all of that to the woman who died at Osborne, and to her reasons for going there in the first place. Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, came to the island for one thing, above all others: privacy. As a reigning monarch, Victoria could barely step outdoors without being watched, and she wanted a place where her growing family could walk on a beach unobserved. In 1845, on the advice of her Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, the royal couple bought the Osborne estate from a family called the Blackfords, on the northeast coast, looking out across the Solent towards Portsmouth. They paid for it not from the public purse, but from Victoria's own fortune. The old house was too small for what they wanted, so Albert, who fancied himself an architect, decided to build his own. He thought the view resembled the Bay of Naples, and he set out to make the house match the idea. Working with the master builder Thomas Cubitt, he pulled down the old place and raised in its stead an Italian palace, with 2 tall towers and a terrace of statues stepping down towards the water. The central wing where the family actually lived was contracted at £15,000. It was finished in 1851, and from that moment the small island off Portsmouth was where the British monarchy went to be an ordinary family. Victoria loved the place. She raised her children in its grounds, and after Albert died and she vanished into years of deep mourning, she leaned on the seclusion of the island more heavily than ever. For much of the second half of her reign, the ruler of the largest empire in history governed it from a villa beside the sea. And Osborne was never only a holiday house. It became a working seat of empire, and the grandest room in it was built to say exactly that. In the last years of her reign, a vast new hall was added, the Durbar Room, its walls and ceiling worked in white plaster into the intricate patterns of Mughal India, designed by a craftsman named Pai Ram Singh under the eye of the father of the writer, Rudyard Kipling. Victoria never once travelled to the country she ruled as Empress of India, and so she had a fragment of it built for her on the island instead, and dined beneath that carved ceiling while the real thing stayed an ocean away. Ministers crossed the Solent with their red boxes. Foreign royalty and heads of state came to pay their respects. Treaties were weighed and honours dispensed within sight of the yachts at Cowes, and for weeks at a time, the centre of British political gravity shifted from Westminster to a villa beside the sea. Where the Queen went, the aristocracy followed, and the island filled with people who wanted to be near her. 10 miles west of Osborne, at the mouth of the River Medina, the little town of Cowes had already become the headquarters of British yachting. A gentleman's sailing club had formed there in 1815, taking over an old castle that Henry VIII had built to guard the Solent, and turning it into the most exclusive club afloat. It became the Royal Yacht Squadron, under the patronage of George IV, and its summer regatta grew into Cowes Week, the fixture that still empties Mayfair onto the water every August. Then, in 1851, a schooner called America crossed the Atlantic, sailed a race around the island, beat the entire British fleet, and carried home a trophy that has been fought over ever since. Today, the whole world knows that trophy as the America's Cup. It is named after a boat that won its first race in the water off these shores. For a few weeks every summer, Cowes became the social capital of the empire. The royal yacht lay at anchor in the roads. The Prince of Wales raced his own boats against the great industrial fortunes of the age, and the harbour crowded with vessels whose owners had come from half the world away to be seen there. To be invited to Cowes Week was to have arrived, and the racing and the parties and the money all existed for one reason: that the Queen was 10 miles up the coast at Osborne, and fashionable Britain had rearranged its whole summer around her. The island's own people mostly watched that world from the outside, working its kitchens and crewing its yachts, but the money it brought spilled down through the towns and paid for much of what the island became. But the real Victorian boom here was not built on royalty or on racing, it was built on illness. Along the southern coast, sheltered beneath a long wall of cliffs, ran a strip of land called the Undercliff, where the rock had slipped seawards over centuries and left a warm terrace facing full south. Doctors decided that the air there was the finest in England for diseased lungs. In an age before antibiotics, when tuberculosis killed roughly 1 in every 7 people who died in England, a mild climate and clean sea air were the only medicine anyone could offer. The small town of Ventnor, barely a hamlet at the start of the century, swelled almost overnight into a resort for the consumptive rich. By the 1880s, its population had passed 5,000, and the fashionable set had given it a nickname. They called it Mayfair by the sea. Grand villas and hydropathic hotels climbed the terraces above the town, and its streets filled with bath chairs and private physicians, and the particular hush of a place where a great many people were quietly trying not to die. The treatment itself was mostly AIR. Patients were kept outdoors for hours in every season, wrapped against the cold on open verandas facing the water, on the theory that the mild salt air of the Undercliff could do for a ruined lung what no medicine of the age could manage. In 1868, a doctor named Arthur Hill Hassall, who had himself come to the island to treat his own tuberculosis, founded a hospital at Ventnor, unlike anything else in the country. The Royal National Hospital for Diseases of the Chest was built as 10 separate blocks, strung out along a quarter of a mile of coast, each one turned to face the sun and set well apart from the next, so that patients could be wheeled straight out into the open air as part of the treatment. By the time of the Second World War, it had treated something like 38,000 people. For the sickest of them, the Island Railway ran a special service, a train that carried invalids without a single stop from the pier at Ryde right through to Ventnor, to a station cut into the hillside almost 300 feet above the town. The local people had a name for that train too. They called it the Invalid Express. The soft air that drew the dying drew the famous as well. As early as 1819, a young poet named John Keats, already coughing the blood that would kill him, came to the island to write beside the sea. 30 years later, in 1849, Charles Dickens took a house at Bonchurch, on the Undercliff, and wrote much of David Copperfield there, the novel he later called his favourite of everything he had ever written. Not long after, the poet laureate, Alfred Tennyson, settled at Farringford in the island's far west, and around him gathered one of the strangest artistic circles in Victorian England. Tennyson grew so besieged by day trippers hoping to glimpse him that he took to walking the high chalk headland behind his house to escape them, a down that still carries his name. His neighbour was the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, who arrived in 1860 and turned her house into a studio, cornering visitors into sitting for portraits that are now counted among the finest photographs of the whole century. Even Karl Marx came, 3 times, taking rooms at Ventnor in the early 1880s to rest his ruined chest in the same sea air the aristocracy paid so dearly for. For a few remarkable decades, if you were rich or gifted or dying, this was the place you came. It was a strange concentration of fame for so small a place. A farming island cut off by the sea had become at once the private garden of the monarchy, the sick room of the nation, and a bolt hole for its greatest writers and artists. Nowhere else in Britain packed so much into so few square miles, and every part of it rested on the same thing, the crossing that held the ordinary world at a comfortable distance. To carry the visitors who could afford the journey, the island rebuilt itself around the railway. The line reached Sandown in 1864, then was driven on through a long tunnel bored beneath the Downs to Ventnor 2 years later. By the end of the century, the whole coast had become one continuous holiday front. Ryde had one of the oldest seaside piers in the country, long enough to carry its own tramway out over the mud to meet the ferries. Sandown and Shanklin had grown from fishing villages into resorts of tall seafront hotels, boarding houses and winter gardens, every one of them built on the same promise, that this was the place the best people came. And for a time after the Queen was gone, the island only grew busier. The exclusive resort of the Victorians opened out across the first half of the 20th century into something far larger and more democratic. Paddle steamers packed with day trippers churned across from Portsmouth and Southampton. Brass bands played on the front at Sandown. Shanklin lit its cliff gardens with coloured lamps in the evening, and ordinary families from the industrial towns of the mainland came for their 1 week beside the sea. Right through the 1950s and into the 60s, the island was one of the busiest holiday coasts in England. At the summer peak, the ferries ran almost shoulder to shoulder across the Solent, and the platform at Ryde Pier Head could be as crowded as any in London. But the family that had made it fashionable had already left. Victoria died at Osborne in January 1901, and her son, the new King Edward VII, had little use for his mother's island retreat. Within a year, he had given the whole estate to the nation. Osborne became a college for naval cadets, then a convalescent home for officers, and the royal family simply stopped coming. The last cadets marched out in 1921. It was the first of the island's 3 great engines to fall silent, and the others would follow. The chest hospital at Ventnor, which had drawn the sick for almost a century, was made obsolete by the arrival of antibiotics, the very cure it had been built to manage without. It closed its wards in 1964 and was pulled down 5 years after that. Where 10 blocks of open-air wards had once stood, there is now a botanic garden. The railway went the same way. The trains that had once carried invalids and holidaymakers alike were cut back to almost nothing. The branch lines lifted, and the line to Ventnor closed for good in 1966, its cliff-top station left to the weeds. One by one, the reasons a person might cross the water were disappearing, and nothing was arriving to take their place. The royal court had gone, the cure had gone, and for a while it looked as though the island's time in the spotlight was simply over. And then, at the very end of that same decade, it had a second act, one that could hardly have been less like the first. It began quietly, with a small gathering of a few thousand people at a farm near Godchill in 1968. The following year, in 1969, the pair of local brothers who had promoted that first event pulled off something extraordinary. They persuaded Bob Dylan to headline. Dylan had not played a paid concert in 3 years, not since a motorcycle crash had pulled him out of public life, and now the quietest island in England had coaxed the most famous musician alive back onto a stage. Reporters flew in from across the world, the Beatles came to watch from the crowd, and somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people crossed the water to see him. For one long day, a field on a small English island held the most watched stage in the world, and that, it turned out, was only the rehearsal. In August 1970, the festival returned, on a chalk hillside called Afton Down near Freshwater, and it swelled into something nobody had planned for and nobody could control. The bill was one of the greatest ever assembled. The Doors gave what would become their last film performance. Jimi Hendrix walked out under the lights and played one of the last great sets of his life. 18 days later, he was dead. The roads across the west of the island seized solid. A temporary city of tents spread across the downs, and on the hill above the arena, a vast second crowd gathered, who had paid nothing at all, watching for free over the heads of the people inside. By the count that went into the record books, 600,000 or 700,000 people came, larger than Woodstock the summer before, on an island whose entire resident population was scarcely more than 100,000. The promoters themselves later came to believe the true figure was closer to half that. Either way, for one long weekend, the sleepiest corner of England held one of the biggest gatherings the country had ever seen. The island was appalled. To the people who lived there, the festival had felt like an invasion, a quiet hillside vanishing under noise and litter, and hundreds of thousands of strangers who had arrived by ferry and could not easily be sent home. It was, in a way, entirely in character. The island had always been a place that guarded its quiet, that liked its visitors to be the right sort and to leave at the end of the season. It had welcomed a queen who wanted to hide, and a hospital full of the genteel dying. 500,000 young people on a hillside was another matter altogether, and so the island did something that few places anywhere would ever dare. It went to Parliament and had the festival banned. A local act of 1971 made it an offence to hold an open-air gathering of more than 5,000 people on the island overnight without a licence, and the man who drove it through was the island's own Member of Parliament, Mark Woodnutt. The event that had briefly made this the centre of the musical world would not return for 32 years. The place that had just staged one of the largest crowds in British history had gone to the highest authority in the land to make certain it could never happen again. There is a small, quiet monument to all of it over at Freshwater. In the garden of the house where Julia Margaret Cameron once photographed the Victorian great and good, there now stands a bronze statue of Jimi Hendrix, guitar in hand, looking out towards the down where he played his final British show. The photographer of one golden age and the guitarist of another, sharing a lawn above the sea, both of them drawn to the same small island, both of them gone. For almost the whole of its history, the water around the island had been its single greatest asset. It kept the crowds out and the Queen private, kept the air clean and the pace slow, and it was, in every sense, the entire point of the place. Somewhere in the last half-century, quietly and without anyone ever deciding it, that same water turned from a defence into a trap. Part of it was a decline shared by every English seaside resort, as cheap package holidays put guaranteed sunshine within reach of ordinary families, and the crowds who had once filled Sandown flew to Spain instead. Blackpool and Margate felt that same chill, but those towns you could at least drive to. The island had a problem all of its own. There is no bridge to the island and no tunnel. Everything and everyone that comes or goes, every holiday maker, every lorry of food, every resident driving to a hospital appointment on the mainland has to cross a few miles of the Solent by boat. And the boats are extraordinarily expensive. The crossings are shared between a handful of operators. The ferry lines, White Link and Red Funnel, and the little hovercraft that still skims across from Ryde. And islanders have said for years that they live beside the most expensive stretch of water in the world. When a European study finally put numbers to the claim in 2024, it could not quite confirm the world, but it did find that the short crossing between Lymington and Yarmouth was the most costly in Europe, measured by the pound per mile, and running to nearly £7 for every mile of the trip, dearer even than the tourist routes between the Greek islands and Turkey. For a family on the mainland weighing up a summer holiday, the arithmetic is brutal. A return crossing with the car can cost more than a budget flight to southern Europe, and all it buys is a few miles of grey water instead of a fortnight in the sun. Sample fares on the main routes have climbed by around 4/5 in the space of a single decade. And for the people who actually live on the island, the crossing is not an inconvenience but a wall, and its effect compounds in every direction. A business pays more to bring its stock in and more to send its goods out, so its prices climb. A young person who leaves for work or study finds the fare home dear enough to make visits rare. A hospital appointment that needs a specialist on the mainland can swallow a whole day and a small fortune in fares before any treatment begins. Firms that might have set up on the island look at the cost of moving people and materials across the water and quietly choose the mainland instead. So the crossing has slowly throttled the very tourist trade the Victorians spent a century building, a trade that still pours something like £280 million a year into the island and supports more than a third of its whole economy, some 8,000 jobs in all. You can see what its decline has done most plainly by walking the seafront at Sandown. In 1899, at the very height of the boom, a developer named Henry Lowenfield opened the Ocean Hotel there. It was 97 bedrooms of Victorian confidence looking out over the bay, raised on the site of an old inn where both Charles Darwin and Lewis Carroll are said to have once stayed. For more than 100 years it took guests, running its own orchestra and a ballroom that drew dancers from across the island. Its last ones checked out in 2017. The company that owned it by then collapsed into administration 2 years later, and the empty building has since caught fire more than once, gutted floor by floor. until what stands on the seafront today is a blackened shell hidden behind hoardings. The local council eventually paid £100,000 for a thin strip of land in front of it simply to keep the ruin from being cut off from the sea it was built to face. And the ocean is not alone. Along the same stretch of coast, grand hotels that once had names and doormen and dance bands have burned or rotted or been quietly boarded up, one after another. The Grand, the Royal Cliff, the Parkbury, so many blazes among the empty seafront hotels that islanders came to talk about them almost as a kind of weather. Behind the fronts of Shanklin and Sandown stand rows of shuttered guest houses with faded signs, places that closed one winter and never opened again. Walk the front at Shanklin or Sandown out of season now, and the decline is quiet but unmistakable. Amusement arcades blink at empty pavements. Half the shop fronts carry the names of businesses long gone, and the great hotels loom dark against the sky, with their windows boarded and their gardens run to seed. In summer, the crowds return, and the illusion holds for a few weeks. Then September comes. The visitors cross back to the mainland, and the towns settle again into the long off-season that has slowly become their real character. And in one place, the island is not merely falling down, but sliding bodily into the sea. The Undercliff, that same warm sheltered shelf of slipped rock the consumptives once came to breathe upon, has never actually stopped moving. It has been slipping since at least 1811, when the first great landslip there was recorded. The coast road that ran along it between Ventnor and Neaton has been closed since 2014, cracked apart and abandoned after the ground beneath it shifted and dropped away. Homes there were evacuated and never reoccupied. The road had been the only direct link along that stretch of coast, and losing it cut the southern villages off from one another, adding miles to every journey and leaving a line of abandoned houses to crack apart above the waves. When the government offered around £2 million towards a repair, the council said it was nowhere near enough to fight the geology, and in 2024 its own leader called the idea of rebuilding the road an absolute folly. Then, in December 2023, a little further along the same coast, a fresh landslide opened in the night and forced 20 homes to be cleared before morning. The ground the Victorians had trusted to heal them will not hold still. For all the beauty that still carries the tourists across every summer, the island that Victoria made the most fashionable place in the country is now, in parts, among the poorest in England. By the government's own measure of deprivation, published in 2025, it ranks 83rd out of 296 council areas in England, and inside it there are streets in Ryde and Ventnor that sit among the most deprived neighbourhoods in the whole country. The island has become two places that barely touch. Along the water there are marinas, second homes and comfortable retirements, their prices pushed ever higher by buyers from the mainland. A mile inland lie streets of low wages and seasonal work where that money never reaches. For some families, the fare across is itself out of reach, so that children grow up a few miles from the mainland and set foot on it rarely, if ever. A boy born in the poorest part of the island can expect to live nearly 7 years less than a boy born in the wealthiest, and a girl more than 4 years less. Osborne House still stands above the Solent, its Italian towers facing the water exactly as Albert intended. English heritage has kept it since 1986, and for the price of a ticket, visitors can walk through the rooms where an empire was quietly governed from a seaside villa. Upstairs, the private apartments where Victoria died have been kept almost as they were the day she left them, in the winter of 1901, sealed on her son's orders and never used again. The room waits, perfectly still, for a court that is never coming back. And out beyond the terrace, past the statues Albert set stepping down towards the shore, lies the water that made the Isle of Wight the most desirable place in Britain, and that has since left it stranded, costing more to cross today than almost any stretch of sea in Europe. If you have found this story worth your time, then the video now appearing on your screen is one that I think you are going to want to watch next.